Hi. So I just lost an hour and a half's worth of recording. So here's take two. So before we get started, I wanted to respond to your notes where you wanted me to source the images I use. And normally that would be totally cool and fine. But I use a program called Canva, and it doesn't allow me to see the entire source of their images because the licenses are basically already bought and paid for by Canva. Um, so I don't really have that information beyond who took the picture. I have no date of publication, where it was originally posted, any of that. Um, all right, so let's begin. Hi, my name is Reese Pugachev, pronouns he, him, and today I'll be presenting on trending work experiences. So, we'll be going through personal and studies of work experiences. First, we'll be going through 3 different lenses. I picked the conflict theory, Taylorism, and symbolic interaction. And then we'll be going on to what work looked like in the early 20th century and what it looks like today. And then we'll be taking a look at some critiques of social work and building on what we did in the previous project. So, first we have my work experiences through 3 different lenses, and we're starting with the conflict theory from Karl Marx. This definition is pulled from the textbook. So, according to Marx, the goal of capitalism is profit making, and meeting this goal requires rationality and an emphasis on efficiency. Thus, Marx believed that capitalism contributed to feelings of alienation, as the needs of workers were cast aside, while the interests of capital and the pursuit of profit at any cost were primary. So, how would Marx use my experiences to support his theory? Well, first, there's alienation from both the product and the profit, which we'll get to in a second. So, as I said in the last presentation, retail workers have very little connection to the product they're selling. This is especially apparent in large grocery stores where the food and other items come from all over the world and are manufactured all over the world, but the cashier who rings all of these items through for you has absolutely no connection with these products whatsoever. And what I mean by alienation from profit is that the profit the company makes off of these products that you're selling is not seen by the salesperson or worker at all, nor is it reflected in their wages. If so, it's something probably like 0.00001% of the profit these companies make. As an example, I used to work at Bentley's, and some of the luggage items there were upwards of $500, and that's just for the one suitcase. That's not for an entire set. So that kind of purchase at the time, I believe I was being paid 13, so I think the minimum wage is at 15 now, was way out of my budget. If I were to buy something like that, it would be something I'd have to save and budget for. Never mind the trip that a suitcase would imply. unless I was living out of it. Um, so again, the profit that the company makes from me selling that suitcase is not reflected in my wages. I cannot afford the thing that I'm selling. Um, and furthermore, with again, profit being the primary goal of capitalism, um, all focus is on that. So that creates an idea where the salesperson must be as efficient as possible. And this kind of leans into Taylorism a little bit too, where um, capitalism decides to micromanage as much as possible in order to, again, create that efficiency where um, no deviation is allowed. And that reflects in the kind of control that they have over the worker. I wanted to use an example of uh, on the sales floor, there is no food or drink ever allowed. Um, and that might make sense at first because presumably a customer doesn't want to see the person helping them eat, apparently, because that would be too human. um, you want the customer presumes that they want the salesperson to be completely and utterly focused on them as though they are the only customer in the store. That is the ultimate goal here of capitalism and its focus on gaining profit and nothing else, um, disregarding again human rights. Um, so another more concrete example is, and I'll never forget this, is when I worked in a mall in a store, and they did not allow our water bottles to be stored at the till, which is usually where it is in most mall places. Um, they wanted it to be stored in the back. And now, as you might imagine, um, the back is not where customers are. So um, it made it very difficult to attempt to serve customers and be present on the sales floor and then happen to be thirsty. Um, God forbid you needed water. So to go into the back, even just for a split second, even if you're holding the door open with your foot, um, it still doesn't put the focus on the customer. Anyway, that's an issue that they have. But still, that is a contradiction. So, on one hand, you're supposed to focus completely on the customers, but on the other hand, you have a living, breathing right to drink water whenever the hell you want. Um, so, they really, that is a place where that notions really clashed, and it was very obvious. Um, I think the reason that this rule was in place in the first place was because the back of it was right up against the display window. That's the large window that you see on every store. So I think maybe the head office decided that water bottles were unsightly or something. And one of the things that was implemented while I was working in retail, so it was a change from one thing to another. They didn't want employees hanging out behind the till um, because that meant that you weren't walking the floor and attending to a customer's every whim and need. Um, or making sure that the store was spotless, or making sure that all items were in stock, or um, again, waiting on customers, or trying to get customers to come in, or whatever it is they thought you needed to do. Um, Apparently, standing behind the till kept you from doing that. So, again, this hyper focus and micromanagement towards profit and you as a worker making the company money. Um, and I think employees started hanging out behind the till because it made it look like you were still working, and honestly, you were. Um, while being able to not have to wander the store aimlessly, um, and like attempt to engage customers that really wanted you to go away, and not speak to them, because a lot of the time this kind of persistent, hi, what do you need? Hi, can I do anything for you? Hey, did you know about this discount? Can I do anything for you? Can I do anything for you? Um, you can imagine that as a customer, that would be very irritating if a worker was on you all the time like that. So, but that's what they want. They want you to pester customers. Um, they want you to pester them into buying something, basically. Um, and if you're not doing that, if you're just standing behind the till, then the head office thinks that you're not working. And an extension of that is that you can never, ever sit down while you're on the floor. Um, and the only time that you can sit down is when you're on your break or you're off work entirely. So even then, when you're off work, you're going home probably, right? Um, and if you don't have a car, you're probably going on public transportation, which implies a lot of walking, depending on what city you're in. But regardless, there's always going to be walking. Um, so that kind of limitation on food and drink and the kind of activity you're doing with your body, as in never sitting down, always standing or walking very slowly between aisles, because your store isn't that big, um, in the mall at least, or even if you're walking around in larger stores like Target or Walmart. Um, Again, there's only so much you can do. For example, there's something called front facing, which is making sure that all of the products' labels are facing the front. So they're all the labels are towards the inside of the aisle so everyone can read them. Um, so this is a busybody job. Um, the only time, in my opinion, that that should be necessary is when the person is shelving in the first place. Um, but to do front facing whilst there are no customers, as it ideally should be, right? As long as there's no customers, then all of a sudden you can make sure that the store is clean and all the products are facing the right way. Um, so again, this kind of every single task is has the sole purpose of promoting profit and selling the products in any way possible. So again, this limitation of rights, and what I was going to say, and I completely forgot. I'm sorry, I ramble a lot. Is this kind of movement and behavior eventually has physical health consequence. So not only do you have, mental health issues after all of this because there's no way you can walk out of it without them. You will also have a body that is deteriorating around you because you are not um, moving it in a manner that uses all of your muscles in a way that is healthy. So when you're standing for 8 hours plus every day, that means that all kinds of effects and studies are only just coming out on what all this means. But I can tell you from personal experience that after over a decade of retail work, that I now have fibromyalgia and everything hurts all of the time. So it's pretty rough what standing all that long does to you. And that's not to speak of my knees. So again, that kind of blends into Taylorism and that kind of micromanagement. So Taylorism is the extreme control over the labor process. Taylor thought it was very important to transfer control over decisions, plans, and processes of work to management, leaving workers to engage simply and solely in carrying out their assigned tasks, thus creating an increased efficiency on the shop floor. So, again, that kind of ties into what I was talking about um, with conflict theory as well, because, of course, alienation and um, that sort of thing all connect as theories are wont to do. So a lot of my work experiences would support this theory with what I've already discussed with scientific management, how every little move is micromanaged and simplified and controlled to the point where there's no room for deviation whatsoever. Um, so again, this is a focus on efficiency and profit, right? Um, so, in addition to everything I already mentioned with limitations to food and drink and having to stand all the time, which, by the way, is an American only thing, apparently. In the UK, I believe, cashiers have little chairs behind their till, which is pretty cool. Wonder why that is. Uh, so, one of the keys to efficiency that Taylor talks about um, is, again, simplifying the task. And one of the ways that he wants to reinforce all of these scientific management rules and regulations and procedures is by having more and more managers, right, to kind of break it all down and use that kind of lack of humanization in order to, make a more efficient worker. So one of the great ways of making sure that the worker does not deviate from the goal of profit is to isolate the worker from their coworkers via artificial competition. So one of the ways that this artificial competition happens is through something called a sales goal. So this is more often seen in outlet stores and malls where each employee, each individual will have a specific sales goal, or the entire, quote, team. So that's everyone you work with because not very many people are employed in one store or another. So either individual or the team has a sales budget, and that's either daily, weekly, or monthly. And if that goal is not reached, then that's grounds for firing. And especially if you repeatedly do not reach those goals. Um, and management and head office will have you believe that it is entirely your fault if you do not reach that sales goal, regardless if you're part of a team or not. Um, they will say that it is your fault because and they'll find all kinds of reasons. You didn't greet every customer that came in. You didn't do this properly. You didn't do that properly. You should have pushed harder to sell this. You should have pushed harder to sell that. Um, and all kinds of completely made up, fanciful reasons. They'll do anything to, again, micromanage your behavior, essentially. Um, and one of the more obvious ways that uh, this artificial competition comes into play is commission-based work, where instead of a sales budget that you have, or sorry, a sales goal that you have to meet, you have your wage cut. So, in order to compensate for the money you'll make, you totally will make by selling products. And of course, this in reality doesn't always work. As much as they try to sell you the idea that, oh, you could make, 10 grand in one day if you just sell this and this and this. I imagine car salesmen are particularly hit by that sort of thing. um, so, because even then, when you sell a product, you only get a percentage of that profit, right? It's not the whole thing. Um, because of course it isn't. The company needs to make money too, right? Um, so in this way, with commission, it isolates the worker from their coworkers by making that kind of artificial competition between them. So this is where stealing customers comes in, where you might be helping a customer and say you had to go to the back to check whether or not something was in stock or whether you had more of the thing, and you come back and your coworker is helping them instead. So that's what stealing customers is, and that's again another way of reinforcing scientific management and all the micromanagement rules and control of your behavior. So this way, the worker reinforces it on their coworkers, um, and again, that goes for sales goals too. Is um, if it's not your fault, it's somebody else's, and it's never the manager's, of course. And another thing I wanted to talk about on Taylorism is it's kind of like my work experiences, of course, are very much a distilled and refined version of Taylorism, as I'm sure the kind of capitalistic world we live in right now is only what he dreamed of. Um, and one of the great consequences of this scientific management that he decided on was that in order to um, be a manager is nearly impossible. So, uh, so there's a few ways that it happens. So, what I mean by a locked management position is that there's very little upward movement for anyone. So, um, the managers that do exist are often pulled from other locations um, or hired within somehow. It's always their own employees. And it very, very rarely is someone on the lower rung moving up a step. So, um, The only way that a lower end worker, like a cashier at a grocery store, would end up in a management position is if they completely heartlessly just reinforced all of the control behaviors onto their other coworkers and constantly, like if someone was leaning against their till, um, they would tell them to, they would go over and tell them, hey, you can't do that. Which, by the way, is absolutely a thing. You're not allowed to lean against your till when you're a cashier. Um, you're not allowed to lean against anything, most especially, by the way. Um, and then, in addition to telling your other coworker off for doing something like that, you also go to your manager and tell them that that's what happened and you name this person and everything. The more you do that, the more likely you are to move up in the world, um, up in that company, as it were. Um, but the only way that you would move up, even if you did all of that, is for a position to open up. And the only way that that happens is if they can't find anyone in their upper echelon of managers in order to just place there. You are never hired from the ground up, very rarely at least. So, yeah, that's what I mean by that. And now we're moving on to symbolic interactionism. Though the textbook did a great job of explaining it, I needed a more succinct definition for this. So this definition is from Brian Turner's entry under symbolic interactionism in the Cambridge Dictionary of Sociology. And he says that symbolic interactionism is a concept built up by Bloomer, of course. Um, things, stuff and things do not have intrinsic meaning. Rather, the meanings of things derive from and emerge through social interaction. Humans learn what things mean as they interact with one another. In doing so, they rely heavily on language and the communicative processes it facilitates. Through these processes, people learn how to define and act towards the objects and events and experiences that make up their environment. In essence, they learn to see and respond to symbolically mediated realities, realities that are socially constructed. Now, how does my work experience support Bloomer's theory of symbolic interactionism? So, one of the things that first came to my mind with this is the kind of manufactured relationship between a salesperson and a customer. So there's a kind of script that they give you or teach you. Sometimes it's written down, sometimes it isn't. Um, and it's to greet every customer, it's to tell them of any sales going on, it's to consistently and often offer help and essentially wait on a customer's hand and foot. Um, and this script can be altered as long as, again, the focus is on establishing that rapport with the customer and finding out what it is they want to buy and selling that to them in addition to other items, as many as possible. The more items, the better. The more expensive, obviously, the better. So, this script, the way it applies to symbolic interactionism is that every response is scripted and loaded with meaning. So, when you're asked, "Hi, how are you?" then a customer is expected to respond in a specific way. This is all like social cues, all mixed into marketing and um, how to sell something essentially. So it's all woven in there. It's all there to build off of what society already had going. All those, again, social cues and um, normalized social behaviors, and turning them into that rapport and relationship between the salesperson and the customer to make that, the more personal you can make it feel, the better, because that way you can essentially guilt trip the customer into buying something. Because if you don't, you're going to hurt your best friend or something. You're not going to let them sell something to you. And one of the ways that symbolic interaction is more obvious in my work experience is the various sale and marketing languages that they use in order to trick customers into stores and therefore buying something. One of the most obvious examples of this is buy one, get one. So that's where you buy an item, usually at regular price, and then get another item either for discount or for free. So these the symbols of like BOGO is part of the symbol, right? It's that part of that language, um, is all packed in with how they expect customers and salespeople to react. So a salesperson has a specific set of that script to reinforce when there's specific different types of sales, like a BOGO. So when there is a BOGO and you see that that person is already buying the one item, you remind them of the sale and say, well, why don't you get one more? And so on and so forth. It's almost reinforcing kind of like an endless BOGO. The more you buy, the more you get, right? Because you get technically two of one thing and da, 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 da. So another example of these kind of marketing tricks is false scarcity. So this is like limited promotional items, like at Starbucks, that would be like a pumpkin spice or the peppermint hot chocolate at Christmas, even though they're annual. And or things like clearance items or things that are on like a quote unquote super sale, um, where they like there's a huge percentage off of them or something. More often than not, and I would say like 99.9% of the time, these items will come back in some form or another. Um, if you're very specific about it, like if, for example, an item of clothing, if you want that exact design and that exact color and exactly where those seams are and where the ruffles are or what have you, then yes, that's limited. You're probably not going to see it again. But you probably will see similar colors and similar styles in the future. Nothing is as limited as it seems. And honestly, if you're looking for, something specific like that, you're probably not going to wait on it, right? You're probably going to give in to the false scarcity that they give you. And the only exceptions to this rule is, again, things that are a little bit more specific, like collectible items and such, are usually quite limited, like different poses and the like. This is especially prevalent with Funko Pops, if you know what those are. They are these little figurines that you can collect from movies and video games and TV shows and all kinds of things. And a lot of them have different costumes and poses and designs. Um, so those specific sets are often extremely limited. You can only get them for a specific time period and often only at a certain store. Um, that's an exception to the rule. But again, that's just another way to make you buy something or buy multiples of something, because it is so apparently limited. So again, this kind of behavior and reaction to these symbolic concepts of sales, again, are just more ways that you are essentially socialized and taught to behave a certain way by marketing companies and campaigns and such. All right, on to the next subject, which is what work looked like in the early 20th century and what it looks like today. So, two of the ways that work is different from what it was in the 20th century the early 20th century versus now, is gender inequality. So, um, there were a lot more women that were homemakers, and that is to say nothing of the jazz culture or the effects of World War One. Um, and women very rarely had roles outside of childcare and the home, um, despite any education they might have otherwise. And speaking of which, the division of labor is certainly very different, as instead of having uh, family businesses, as it were, in specific industries, we have highly specialized workers doing just, scanning items through a till, or, um, you know, putting labels on a product or something. So, though factory work and that kind of assembly line was still very prevalent in the early 20th century, it wasn't quite as refined and distilled as it is now. And as such, with that kind of um, more prevalent of family businesses rather than factories, the early 20th century had a lot less had a lot less educational requirements than we do now. And that's a result of all kinds of things, which there's a whole video in your lectures about that. Um, so, for the family business, that you didn't really need, a degree or any post-secondary education or even high school in order to work on the farm or in the general store or whatever it is your family did for a living. That was what the children were often expected to do, is to continue that line. Um, but yeah, so it's still pretty different. It's just more refined, I guess. So, and ways that the work today is similar to what it was in the early 20th century is the idea that as long as you work hard enough, you'll get where you're going to go, the kind of American dream. And another way it's still similar is that income inequality is still extremely prevalent, and if not more so than it was in the 1900s and 20s. And that's to say nothing again of the effects of the world wars on the economy and society. So again, so the poor are still getting poorer, and this idea that um, if you just work hard enough and you have the right education and the right skills, you'll move up in the world. Um, Even though today, rather than in the early 20th century, um, today those flaws and phrase and are starting to show. It is still a very prevalent idea that many of our society members have. Taking a look at what is behind social work and some critiques. Um, Building on what I had before is we were talking about uh, how the cultural value of social work and the wages and oh, I don't remember what else. And there was one more thing, and I don't remember what it was. um, but let's keep those terms in mind. So one of the critiques of social work is that it's kind of turned into what Lipsky, and this is Michael Lipsky in his book Street Level Bureaucracy Dilemmas of the Individual in Public Service. So, the, so he believes that public service has kind of turned into this bureaucracy where those on the lowest rung, i.e., social workers, were slaves to policies and were unable to really make the change that their job implies that they should be able to. So he came up with the term street level bureaucrats, and he defined them as those that operate in an environment that conditions the way they perceive problems and frame solutions to them. These street level bureaucrats work with a relatively high degree of uncertainty because of the complexity of the subject matter, people, and the frequency or rapidity with which decisions have to be made. Now, the way this explains or reinforces the way that social work might engineer efficiency is through these policies and bureaucratic paperwork that public service agents have to go through. So I think one of the best ways of explaining it with an example is what David Howie did in his article, Child Abuse and the Bureaucratization of Social Work. So Howie basically went through saying how, once upon a time in the 80s, we realized that parents kill children on occasion, and that turns out that's bad. And how the government and society essentially worked to mediate the problem and to figure out how to identify these issues before they happen. So he went on to say very succinctly, I think, um, how how this all came together to make such a huge problem and what Lipsky was essentially talking about. How he says that children continue to die at the hands of their parents. The response still seems to be to create more procedures and more guidelines. The sheer scale and compass of these documents make it almost inevitable that the social worker with a dead child on her caseload will have failed in some aspect of her highly regulated practice. Simply adding new procedures in the wake of yet another tragedy merely compounds the problem. This pushes the social worker into ever more defensive forms of practice, which makes her less sensitive to the people involved and more concerned with the procedures which govern her behavior. So he really hits the nail on the head here. So what he's trying to say is that these street-level bureaucrats have essentially no choice in the matter, and because of how overworked they are, because of the procedures they have to follow, because of how regulated their behavior and attitudes and decision making is, they are forced to be in a position where they are made to decide over one extreme over another and have that death sometimes still on them. And again, this is with the focus on efficiency, on making sure that it's all written down, that, this parent did this, or they have this item on their shelf, and therefore that means that one day they'll kill their child. So therefore, I have to take this child in, or that's what it is. It all needs to be written down. And as long as they've got something written down, that means that they did a good job. And again, they don't have a real choice in that. They're not the ones that make the policies that tell them to do all this. They're the social workers that are actually in contact with the public. They have no control over the policies that they enforce. So again, this is a way of engineering efficiency and scientific management, and making sure that every employee has a specific type of behavior and has a specific goal in mind. And in this case, that's numbers, that's budgeting, that's tracking people, kids, that's, again, writing it all down and turning it into, turning abuse and trauma and all kinds of suffering that, is going on in our society into just numbers, into statistics, so that the government or whoever creates the policies can understand that they've done a good thing and that they are able to put more money into it or take away, or they're still making a profit and such. So the goal is still profit making, even in social work. And I mean that because of who is essentially implementing these policies, and why they might put more money into it or less, why they might cut funds or why they might put more into it. The goal is always to have those numbers, those stats, to again put it on record somewhere that that's what the problem translates into. So this comes together to provide a kind of essential contradiction in rationalization. So, as Lipsky puts it, to deliver street-level policy through bureaucracy is to embrace contradiction. On the one hand, service is delivered by people to people, invoking a model of human interaction, caring, and responsibility. On the other hand, service is delivered through bureaucracy, invoking a model of detachment and equal treatment under conditions of resource limitations and constraints, making care and responsibility conditional. And in my personal experience, this speaks to the kind of requirements you have to meet in order to benefit from any social programs like, for example, Alberta Works, or any income benefits. There's a specific criteria you have to meet, and it is absolutely up to whoever's working on your file or case, up to their discretion whether or not what's going on in your life sucks enough in order to meet those requirements, or if there's specific, it could be anything, honestly. There's all kinds of rules going on. In the case of income benefits, and I don't mean EI, by the way, I mean like our version of welfare. There's even like an exact number, and if you're like $1 over it, then you can't, enter the program and use that money to live, essentially. And again, in my personal experience, that number is completely disengaged and alienated from the actual public, from the actual problems that the income benefits are supposed to try and solve. It's just, it's a made up number. I don't know what goes into it. I'm sure I could check it out, but it is completely alienated from actual reality and experiences. So again, even if these social workers do want to help and they aren't completely burnt out yet or less sensitive to the people involved, then there's still very little that they can do. They are essentially, their hands are tied by the procedures and the limited resources that they might have, whatever the program might be that they are part of. So how this builds on what we previously had. So for example, the cultural value of social work. And as I said in my previous one, it wasn't very high. So unlike doctors, for example, social workers aren't held very highly, especially CPS workers. And why is a whole other thing. So this engineering efficiency, street level bureaucrats, the rationalization they have to go through, the alienation from their own clients and customers and the public, and this focus on statistics and numbers and budgets and money absolutely contributes to why social work might be valued less culturally than other occupations. And as to wages, how much we pay social workers, though in my opinion the number I found is quite high, on average social workers are quite underpaid for the amount of work that they do, according to personal accounts from friends and family. So it seems like it's because of its lower cultural value that thus they aren't paid as much as they might think that they should be. So again, there's definitely problems in all fields, and social work is certainly one of them. All right, so I think that's it. Here are my citations. And I also added some further readings. I'm not expecting either of us to read these. They were just, this is just like a list of articles I either couldn't access but really found interesting, or I skimmed to kind of build on the knowledge that I found for the sources I did quote, like Lipsky and Howie. I only found them through these sources, so that's essentially why they're there and why I think they were relevant enough to put in. Um, and you might have noticed the little red camera that is in every slide. That's my own little cheeky metaphor uh, towards 1984 and how, you know, capitalism and profit making kind of turns into that kind of same scary dystopia of controlling every single little behavior that people do and simplifying workers' tasks to the point where they require nothing but the company and nothing else in order to do their work. No education requirements whatsoever, no thinking creatively, nothing. Um, so, yeah, I believe that is the conclusion, and I suppose I will see you in the next one.